The sharp metallic clang echoed through the mansion's kitchen. At first, it could have been mistaken for nothing more than a fork slipping into the trash. But to William Carter, standing frozen in the doorway, it sounded like betrayal. There she was, Charlotte Hayes, his fiancée, impeccably dressed even in the early morning, her manicured hand resting on the lid of the stainless steel trash bin. In the pit of that bin, mixed with coffee grounds and crumpled napkins, lay something that never should have been there. A small silver bracelet, wrapped hours earlier in delicate gift paper by the hands of his 9-year-old son. William's chest tightened. That bracelet wasn't just jewelry. It was the result of weeks of saving, of a child's effort to give thanks to the woman who had cared for him when no one else could, Margaret Brown, the housekeeper who had become Edward's safe harbor since his mother's passing. And Charlotte had thrown it away. She turned slightly, catching William's eyes at the doorway. For a split second, her polished smile faltered, then quickly returned. "Oh, darling," she said lightly, as if discarding a child's sacrifice was the most natural thing in the world. "It was just cheap. Not fitting for this house. I thought it best to get rid of it." But William didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat locked. His blood thundered in his ears. He had seen enough. Her gesture, her disdain, the cold indifference. A woman who claimed to want a family had just humiliated his son in the cruelest way possible. What Charlotte didn't realize was that Edward himself had seen it too. The boy stood frozen at the garden door, his small hands clenched into fists, his chest rising and falling as if he were trying to hold back tears. He had poured his heart into that gift, his savings, his innocence, his gratitude. And in a single careless motion, Charlotte had crushed it. William's gaze shifted from his fiancée to his son, and in that instant, something shifted inside him. He knew one truth with absolute certainty. This story wasn't about a bracelet. It was about respect, dignity, and the heart of a boy who deserved better than deceitful smiles and shallow love. That was the moment everything began to unravel. But to understand how they had arrived here, how a child's small act of kindness could reveal the truth behind a glittering facade, we need to go back. Back to the quiet pain of a boy who missed his mother, the silent devotion of a woman who cleaned more than floors, and the ambitions of a woman who thought love could be replaced with diamonds and status. Because this wasn't simply the story of a millionaire discovering his fiancée's cruelty. It was the story of how a child's pure heart exposed lies that money had tried to hide. It was about how one simple bracelet, bought with nickels and dimes, became more valuable than any jewel in the Carter mansion. And as you'll soon see, what William chose to do next would change not only his son's life, but his own destiny forever. If you love emotional and heartwarming stories, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell, so you'll always be the first to hear our next story. Now let's begin. The bracelet had first appeared in Edward's life as a sketch on a crumpled notebook page, a wobbly oval with tiny dots to mark where the light might catch. He'd drawn it late at night, the desk lamp haloing his small hands as he counted coins from a blue tin, quarters that he'd saved from weekly allowances, a few dollar bills he'd earned by feeding the neighbor's cat when Mrs. O'Malley went to visit her sister in Boston, and a fistful of nickels William had told him to keep after a supermarket line moved too fast for proper change. It wasn't much, but he guarded it like treasure. The shop where he finally found it wasn't the sparkling kind Charlotte preferred. It was a narrow storefront on a side street off Madison, the sort of place that smelled faintly of cedar and cotton twine. A bell above the door gave a soft ring when Edward slipped inside one Saturday morning with Margaret's grocery list folded in his pocket. He was supposed to pick up tea and a bag of sugar. Instead, his feet steered him toward a glass case where bracelets and pendants lay on velvet. "Looking for something special?" the shopkeeper asked, lowering her reading glasses and smiling in a way that reminded him, ache like a pinch, of his mother. "It's for someone important," he murmured. "Not expensive. Just right." They chose a slender silver chain with 3 small beads along the center. Not diamonds, not anything that would make a magazine page. But when the shopkeeper placed it against the back of Edward's hand, it winked delicately, like a secret shared. He counted out his money carefully, coins clinking in that quiet store, and accepted the bracelet in a small paper box tied with white string. The shopkeeper added a square of tissue paper and a scrap of soft ribbon. For the finishing touch, she said. Gifts are half about the love and half about the wrapping. Edward smiled. It's all about the love, he said, and the shopkeeper nodded, as if he'd said something very wise. Back at the mansion, he hid the box at the back of his desk drawer behind a math workbook and a baseball he meant to return to Liam from down the block. For 2 evenings, he practiced what to say. Thank you is too small. You make the house feel safe sounded strange. In the end, he decided he would just hand it to her and let his heart fill in the words. The morning he chose was bright and thin with early light. The Hudson shone like a strip of steel beyond the trees. The Carter mansion, all glass and stone, liked to pretend it was immune to seasons and sadness, but Edward had learned it could be warmed by small things. The smell of toast Margaret always burnt slightly on purpose because he liked the edges, the hum of the kettle, the sound of her shoes, soft-soled and dependable, crossing tile. He found her in the kitchen with a jar of daisies, sleeves rolled up, humming the tune of a hymn she said her mother loved. Good morning, my lamb, she said, glancing at him the way people do when they've known you long enough to read your mood before you speak. Eat first, then school. Margaret, I've got something. His voice came out thin. He pulled the box from his pocket like it might fly away if he didn't keep 2 fingers on the ribbon. It's to say thank you. For the tea when I'm sick, for checking my homework, for knowing when I'm sad and not asking why before you brew the tea. Her smile faltered, not from displeasure, but because it was trembling. Edward, she whispered, as if the room had turned sacred. You sweet boy. He pushed the box into her hands, then stuffed his own into his pockets, so he wouldn't fidget. Margaret untied the ribbon with the sort of care people save for Christmas mornings and years-old letters. When she lifted the lid and slipped her fingers under the tissue, the bracelet caught the kitchen light and sent a shy gleam across the steel counter. Oh, she breathed. Oh, it's beautiful. It's simple, he said, suddenly nervous. I thought simple is good. Like you. Simple is honest, she replied, eyes shining. Simple is true. She moved around the counter to hug him, and he buried his face in the crook of her shoulder, swallowing relief. She smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and starch, and that old perfume she wore on Sundays, the one she said was too fancy for weekdays, and yet somehow lingered on her sweaters, because she hugged people too often for rules to matter. When she pulled back, Margaret fastened the bracelet around her wrist. It wasn't perfect, that was the point. The bead sat slightly off-center, making it look alive, breathing with a pulse in her hand. She stretched her arm toward the light, and the silver winked again. I shall wear it whenever I can, she said. And when I can't, I shall keep it close and touch it when I need courage. Courage, he asked, tilting his head. She pressed her palm over the beads. There are days in every life when you need reminding. You are loved. This will do the reminding. Outside the kitchen, past the doorway that framed their shared brightness, Charlotte Hayes lingered, her reflection crisp in a blackened window, like a second self watching. The scene should have been invisible to her, too small, too unglamorous to register. But envy has excellent eyesight. It seeks out warmth the way a shadow seeks light, simply to prove it can cover it. Charlotte's world had rules. If a thing wasn't adored by others, it wasn't worth adoring. If it wasn't expensive, it wasn't meaningful. She'd grown good at reading the room, shaping herself into whatever drew eyes and whispered compliments. But here, in this house, the most important glances weren't landing where she expected. A boy's shoulders softened around a housekeeper. A man's guard fell in kitchens and hallways where Charlotte's laughter didn't quite reach. She felt it like a pressure change, like descending in a lift too fast. She stepped into the kitchen with her smile lacquered on. How charming, she said, voice just bright enough to pass for kind. A bracelet. Edward turned instinctively, leaving space at his side, unsure whether to invite her in or shield the moment. I saved my allowance, he offered, half apology, half pride. How industrious, Charlotte said. She took in the bracelet 3 small beads, a modest chain, and saw a verdict on her own place in the house. Margaret dear, she added, reaching out to tap the silver like she was testing a coin. "You are very lucky." "Luckier than most," Margaret replied gently, meeting Charlotte's eyes without flinching. "Not for the gift, though it's lovely. For the giver." Something sparked and curled in Charlotte's chest. "Of course." She turned to Edward, tone soft but angled. "And darling, next time perhaps we should pick a gift together? Something more appropriate for the home, for the standard your father keeps." Edward's cheeks colored. He'd only wanted to say, "Thank you." Suddenly, it felt like he'd broken a rule he hadn't known existed. Margaret, sensing it, slipped an arm around his shoulders. "It's perfect as it is," she said. "Absolutely perfect." William entered a few minutes later, tie crooked as if he debated wearing one and lost interest halfway through. He paused on the threshold, caught by the way the morning looked anchored to the bracelet on Margaret's wrist. He noticed, too, the way Charlotte stood too straight, as if braced against something. "What's this?" he asked, voice low like he'd wandered into a church. "Edward's present," Margaret said simply. William's eyes softened. "That's so." He ruffled his son's hair, amusement and pride pushing the tired out of his face. "Good man." "Very sweet," Charlotte added quickly. "And very earnest." Margaret poured coffee. Edward poured orange juice with the careful solemnity of a boy allowed to participate in adult rituals. For a little while everything held. Cups clinked, toast crackled. The bracelet winked in small, sturdy ways. Charlotte laughed at something William said, her charm effortless again. Only once did she glance down at Margaret's wrist with that quick, assessing look, as if measuring the distance between a simple chain and the life she intended to curate here. After breakfast, routines pulled everyone into their lanes. William took a call in his study, pacing by the window with his jacket tossed over a chair. Edward dashed upstairs to fetch his backpack and returned with a book he wanted to show Margaret after school. Short stories his teacher said had good bones. Margaret began clearing plates, humming again, the bracelet catching and releasing light with every move. Charlotte lingered. She watched the way Margaret touched the bracelet absent-mindedly, the way Edward's eyes brightened each time it flashed. Jealousy offered her its usual lie, that there were only so many glances to go around, so many pockets in a heart. If a housekeeper got one, perhaps a fiance lost hers. She refused to name the ache behind the lie. Fear. Fear that she would never belong to a love she hadn't purchased. Fear that a boy's grief had a language she didn't speak. Fear that in this house, sincerity might outrank spectacle. The house quieted. William's voice drifted through a partially closed door, low and businesslike. Edward's footsteps faded down the hall. Margaret turned to rinse the sink. The bracelet settled briefly, still as a thought that knows itself true. Charlotte crossed the tile on measured heels. She reached the counter where the bracelet had first shone, then the table where Margaret had placed the empty box with its ribbon curled like a sleeping cat. She touched the ribbon with her index finger, traced the loop, and felt a hot, unreasonable anger flare, at the ribbon for being cherished, at the box for being kept, at a boy for having the audacity to give away a piece of his heart to someone who was not her. "Appropriate," she whispered to no one. "We'll fix what's appropriate." The seed was planted. In the fertile dark where envy roots itself, just beneath the polished surface of her smile, something began to grow. It would need only a moment alone in a stainless steel kitchen, a swift lift of a silver lid, and the softest, cruelest clink to bloom. The Carter mansion had a peculiar rhythm, mornings full of rushing footsteps, phones ringing from William's study, and Charlotte's heels marking her presence on the marble floor like a signature. That day, however, after the shared breakfast and Edward's cheerful rush to the garden, silence descended more quickly than usual. Margaret wiped down counters, humming faintly, while sunlight pooled across the kitchen tiles. The bracelet, delicate silver, now warmed by her skin, rested on her wrist as she worked. But Margaret, cautious as always, slid it off before tackling the heavier chores. She placed it carefully on the kitchen table, beside the empty paper box and ribbon Edward had saved with such determination. To her, it was safer there, away from soap suds and potential scratches. She intended to wear it again when she served lunch, to remind Edward that his gift mattered all day long. That small act of prudence would open the door to cruelty. Charlotte entered moments later. No announcement, no cleared throat. Just the staccato rhythm of heels echoing on tile. She paused at the sight of the bracelet lying unguarded on the table. The faintest sneer curved her lips. "Still here," she murmured. "As if it belongs." She glanced over her shoulder. Margaret had stepped into the pantry to fetch flour. The sound of jars and tins muffled behind the door. The kitchen was hers alone. Charlotte's eyes narrowed. To her, that bracelet was more than a child's trinket. It was a symbol of misplaced loyalty. In her mind, affection was a currency, and Edward had just invested it in the wrong person. She reached out, pinching the chain between her polished nails. The silver gleamed once, defiant in the light, before dangling helplessly from her grip. Charlotte held it above the trash bin, her expression twisting between disdain and satisfaction. "Not in this house," she whispered. The lid lifted with a hiss, and in a single calculated motion, she let it fall. The bracelet landed among coffee grounds and damp paper towels with a sharp metallic clink. The sound rang out louder than she expected, echoing in the stillness. She pressed the lid down slowly, as if sealing not just garbage, but evidence. And then silence. Except it wasn't silence. There was breathing. Quick, uneven breathing. Charlotte turned, her spine stiffening. At the threshold of the kitchen door stood Edward. His small hands clutched the wooden frame, knuckles white. His eyes, too wide, too raw, were locked on the trash bin. For a moment, no one moved. Charlotte's painted smile snapped back into place. "Edward," she cooed, as though catching him with a cookie rather than heartbreak. "Darling, you shouldn't leave things lying around. Gifts should be appropriate. Don't you see? That's why I put it away." Her voice carried false sweetness, but Edward wasn't fooled. He had seen. He had heard. The truth pressed down on him, hot and heavy. He wanted to shout that it wasn't hers to throw away. He wanted to scream that Margaret deserved every ounce of love in that bracelet. But his throat closed tight, and tears pricked his eyes. Pride, childish but fierce, kept them from falling. He wouldn't give her the pleasure of watching him cry. Edward turned abruptly, feet pounding against the hallway tiles, and fled through the glass doors into the garden. The air outside was sharp, cooler than the kitchen, but it did nothing to ease the burn in his chest. He sank down beside the family's golden retriever, burying his face into its fur. The dog whined softly, sensing the boy's hurt, nudging him with a wet nose. Back inside, Charlotte exhaled slowly, adjusting her hair in the reflection of the oven door. Relief washed over her, not guilt, but triumph. "Necessary," she whispered. "He needs to learn where affection belongs." But Charlotte had overlooked something. On the landing above the kitchen staircase, hidden by the ornate railing, William Carter had seen everything. He had returned from his study, coffee cup in hand, intending to join his son outside before school. Instead, he'd paused, drawn by the unmistakable metallic clang of jewellery hitting metal. From his vantage point, he saw Charlotte's disdain, Edward's frozen heartbreak, and the escape into the garden. The sight hollowed him. It wasn't just that Charlotte had thrown away a bracelet. It was what the act revealed: contempt for sincerity, blindness to the value of love expressed in its purest form. William had lost his wife years earlier, but he had sworn that Edward would never lose the feeling of being cherished. And now here was a woman he'd almost trusted with that promise, showing herself unworthy in a single gesture. He didn't storm into the kitchen then. His temper simmered, but his instinct was stronger. To protect Edward first, to shield his boy before confronting anyone else. William stepped back into shadow as Charlotte left the kitchen, humming faintly, her heels fading into the hall. He descended the stairs slowly, each step heavy, his decision forming with every beat of his heart. When he reached the garden, he found Edward curled in the grass, shoulders hunched, the dog pressed close against him. The boy didn't notice his father at first. His head was bowed, and his small fists rubbed at his eyes. William's chest tightened. He crouched beside him, setting the coffee aside. "Edward," he said gently, voice low, "something happened, didn't it?" The boy stiffened, but didn't answer. He shook his head, lips pressed tight. William rested a hand on his son's shoulder. "You don't have to say it. I saw." Edward's head jerked up, eyes wide. You saw." "I did." William's gaze was steady, his tone calm but firm. "And I want you to know, what you gave wasn't small. It was priceless. That bracelet held more worth than anything in this house." The boy's breath hitched, and the tears he had held back finally spilled. He collapsed into his father's chest, sobs shaking his small frame. William wrapped his arms around him, holding on as if anchoring both of them. "Listen to me," William whispered against his son's ear. No one has the right to throw away your heart. Not in this house. Not ever." The boy clung tighter, and for the first time since the clink of silver against steel, hope flickered in his chest. Inside the mansion, the kitchen sat quiet, but the trash bin held more than scraps. It held a symbol, a choice made in cruelty. And before the day ended, William knew that choice would demand its price. Edward's sobs quieted gradually, but the weight in his chest lingered. His small frame rested against William's side as they sat together on the lawn. The golden retriever lay across Edward's legs, a silent guard sharing his sadness. William stroked his son's hair, staring at the mansion with a gaze that felt older than his years. He had spent his life building empires, signing contracts worth millions, commanding boardrooms with a voice others dared not question. Yet here, in this moment, he felt powerless, because the wound in his son's heart could not be healed by wealth or influence. It required something deeper: protection, truth, and the certainty that love was not disposable. Edward sniffled and pulled back slightly. "Dad," he whispered, eyes glassy, Was it my fault?" William's chest tightened like a fist. "No, Edward. Never. Do you hear me?" He cupped the boy's face, forcing him to meet his eyes. "What you did was right. You showed gratitude. You showed love. That's never wrong." But the boy couldn't finish. His voice broke. "I saw," William said firmly. "I saw what she did. And I promise you, it wasn't about you. It was about her. Some people don't know how to value what matters. That's their failure, not yours." Edward leaned back against him, silent but breathing more evenly. William kissed the top of his head, a simple gesture, yet one he hadn't given often enough. He realized with a pang how much his son had been forced to grow up too quickly since his mother's death. The morning stretched on. Edward eventually trudged inside, coaxed by Margaret to wash his face and have a snack before school. He forced a smile for her, not wanting to burden her with the truth, but his eyes betrayed him. Margaret noticed, of course, she always did, but chose not to press. Instead, she brewed tea and placed it beside him, the same way she always had, trusting that her quiet presence was enough. William, however, carried the weight differently. His footsteps echoed in the empty kitchen. He stood staring at the stainless steel trash bin, as if it were a vault hiding something sacred. For a long moment, he hesitated. Then, jaw tight, he pressed the pedal with his shoe. The lid lifted. The stench of coffee grounds and damp paper rose, sharp and sour. William didn't flinch. He reached in with steady hands, digging past scraps until his fingers brushed against something cool and metallic. Slowly, he pulled it free. The bracelet emerged smeared with coffee, a lettuce leaf clinging to the chain, a bead dulled by a streak of grease. But to William, it gleamed like a diamond. He set it on the counter, grabbed a linen napkin, and began to wipe it clean with deliberate care. Every stroke felt like a vow. This will not end here. This gift will not stay buried. When the last streak faded and the silver caught the light again, William held it up. He thought of Edward's hopeful face, of Margaret's trembling smile, and of Charlotte's dismissive sneer. His decision crystallized in that moment, cold, sharp, unshakable. This wasn't about an object. It was about the principle it carried. He slipped the bracelet into his pocket, pressing it close to his chest. "You'll never be trash again," he murmured. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. Margaret entered, drying her hands on her apron, humming the same hymn. She paused when she noticed William standing rigid by the counter. Her eyes flicked to the napkin, to the faint smear of coffee on the steel bin, then back to his face. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. Her expression softened. heavy with a sadness she tried to mask. "Mr. Carter," she said quietly, "shall I fix you some lunch before your meetings?" William cleared his throat. "Not yet. Thank you, Margaret." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the storm brewing inside him. He added, almost as an afterthought, "And the bracelet, it was a beautiful gift. He chose well." Margaret's lips parted, but she said nothing more. She simply nodded, her eyes glistening, and returned to her tasks. That evening, after Edward returned from school, William waited until the house was quiet. He knocked softly on his son's bedroom door. "Come in," Edward mumbled, his voice subdued. William entered, the bracelet resting in his palm. He sat on the edge of the bed, where Edward lay curled beneath the covers, clutching his dog-eared copy of Charlotte's Web. The boy's eyes widened when he saw what his father held. "Dad." William pressed the bracelet into his son's hand. "It was in the trash," he said simply. "But that's not where it belongs." He tapped his chest. "Here. That's where it belongs." Edward's lips trembled. He looked at the bracelet, then at his father, and tears returned. But these were different, softer, relieved. He threw his arms around William's neck, sobbing against him. "I just wanted her to know how much she means to me," the boy cried. "Margaret's always there. Always. And she smiles even when she's tired. And she makes the house feel alive. And—" "Shoo." William tightened his hold. "You don't need to explain, son. You gave from your heart. That's the purest thing a person can do. If she can't see that, it's her blindness, not yours." Edward clung to him until his breathing steadied. Then, in a whisper, he asked, "What will you do, Dad?" William's eyes hardened. "What I should have done sooner. Protect you." The boy hesitated. "She'll be angry." "She can be as angry as she wants," William said, his tone resolute. "But she will not hurt you again." Later that night, William stood alone in his study. The bracelet lay on his desk, glinting under the lamp. He poured himself a glass of scotch, but didn't drink it. Instead, he stared at the chain, at the way the beads caught the light, and thought of every moment since Charlotte had entered their lives. The charm, the laughter, the veneer of perfection, all now stripped away, leaving only the truth of her contempt. He knew what had to be done. Tomorrow he would confront her. Tomorrow she would hear what no amount of beauty or money could shield her from, the truth about her place in his house, and her failure to respect the heart of his child. For William Carter, the decision was final. The following morning, the Carter mansion seemed to hold its breath. Breakfast was served on the long oak table as usual, silverware gleaming, newspapers folded, steam curling from the coffee pot. But beneath the polished routine, there was a tremor, like the hush before storm. Edward sat silently, pushing scrambled eggs around his plate. Margaret moved quietly in the background, refilling glasses, her new bracelet conspicuously absent. And William? He sat at the head of the table, posture straight, eyes fixed on Charlotte. She arrived fashionably late, descending the stairs in a silk robe the color of wine, her hair perfectly arranged. She offered William a quick kiss on the cheek before sliding into her chair, as if nothing in the world were out of place. Her perfume lingered sharp in the air. "Good morning," she sang. "I trust everyone slept well." Neither William nor Edward replied. Only the faint scrape of cutlery filled the silence. Charlotte's smile faltered, then steadied. She reached for her cup. "Honestly, William, the atmosphere in this house sometimes feels so heavy. We should talk about redecorating. Lighter tones, brighter spaces. Don't you think?" William set down his fork with deliberate calm. His voice was steady, but his eyes cut sharp. "There's already enough brightness in this house, Charlotte. What we lack isn't light, it's respect." The words hung like a blade above the table. Charlotte blinked, her hand pausing midair. "Respect?" she echoed, a laugh trembling at the edges. "Darling, whatever do you mean?" William's gaze didn't waver. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the silver bracelet, now polished to a soft shine. He set it down on the table between them. The clink against the wood was louder than any spoken word. Charlotte's face drained of color. For the first time since William had met her, she looked unprepared. "That," she stammered. That old thing? I thought it had been misplaced. Misplaced. William's voice hardened. I saw you throw it into the trash. The silence that followed was absolute. Edward froze, his eyes flicking between them. Margaret, still at the sideboard, turned away discreetly, though her shoulders were tense. Charlotte recovered quickly, painting her smile back on. William, really, it was nothing. A child's trinket. Hardly appropriate for. Don't, William cut her off, his tone sharp enough to slice the air. Don't insult my son in front of me. Not again. Her smile vanished. You're overreacting. I was only trying to teach him. Teach him what? William leaned forward, eyes blazing. That kindness has no value. That love is cheap. That gratitude belongs in the garbage. He slammed his hand down on the table, making Edward flinch. No, Charlotte. The only lesson here is yours. You showed me exactly who you are. Charlotte's composure cracked. Her lips tightened, her voice rising. Who I am. I am the woman who has stood by your side at every event, who has made you look respectable in front of partners and investors. Do you think they admire you for your charm, William? For your wit? No. They admire the image I help you maintain. William's laugh was low, bitter. Image. That's all you ever cared about. But this house isn't built on image, Charlotte. It's built on love, on trust, on the bond one share with my son. And you dare to trample that. Charlotte's eyes flared. Always him, she snapped, gesturing at Edward. Always that boy, that little shadow you can't stop protecting. You'll never move on, William, not while you cling to him, and that woman who cleans your floors like they're holy ground. Margaret stiffened at the jab, but William didn't flinch. He rose from his chair slowly, towering over Charlotte, his voice steady as a verdict. Margaret has given my son more love than you ever tried to. And Edward, he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Edward is not my shadow. He is my light. Without him, none of this matters. Charlotte pushed back her chair, anger flooding her cheeks. So that's it? You're ending this over a bracelet? Over a servant? William held up the bracelet, its beads catching the morning sun. Not over this. Over what it represents. Over the truth you revealed when you thought no one was watching. Her eyes burned with fury. You'll regret this. No, William said firmly, opening the dining room door. The only regret I have is letting you near my son's heart in the first place. Pack your things. You're leaving today. Charlotte froze, disbelief etched on her face. You can't mean. I do. His tone was final, each word a seal. This house will no longer be poisoned by your cruelty. For a moment, the only sound was the rustle of her robe as she stormed past him, heels striking the marble like gunshots. She didn't look back. Silence returned, heavy but clean. William exhaled, shoulders loosening, as if he had been holding his breath for weeks. He looked down at Edward, whose wide eyes brimmed with relief and confusion. "Dad, is she really gone?" the boy whispered. William knelt beside him, pressing the bracelet into his hands. "Yes, Edward, she's gone. And she's not coming back." He tapped his son's chest gently. "But what you gave, what you felt, will stay here forever. Don't ever doubt that." Edward smiled faintly, tears spilling over. He wrapped his arms around his father, clutching the bracelet as if it were a lifeline. And in that embrace, William knew he had chosen correctly. The storm had broken. The air in the Carter mansion felt lighter, freer. And for the first time in a long while, William believed his home might finally be whole again. The mansion felt different the very next morning. For the first time in months, there was no echo of Charlotte's heels on the marble staircase, no cloying perfume lingering in the hallways, no brittle laughter straining to fill silences. Instead, the air carried something lighter, like the house itself had exhaled a breath it hadn't realized it was holding. Edward woke early. He padded down the stairs barefoot, expecting the same heavy tension of other mornings, but stopped halfway, surprised. From the kitchen drifted the smell of toast and tea, and the sound of humming. Margaret's voice, soft and steady, floated up the stairwell. At the breakfast table, William sat reading the newspaper, his tie draped loosely around his neck, looking less like the untouchable millionaire and more like a man at ease. When Edward appeared, William folded the paper immediately and smiled. "Morning, son. Sleep well." Edward nodded, sliding into his chair. Better than before. Margaret entered with a tray of fruit, the bracelet back on her wrist, polished and shining proudly. Edward's heart lifted at the sight. She set the tray down and ruffled his hair. "Eat, my lamb. You've got a long day ahead." The boy grinned. For the first time in days, food tasted good again. That evening, after school, Edward found his father waiting in the garden. William motioned for him to sit beside him on the wooden bench overlooking the lawn. The sun was dipping low, painting the Hudson in shades of gold and fire. "You know," William began, his voice low, "I built my life chasing things, deals, fortunes, trophies. And I thought I was doing it for the right reasons. But yesterday, watching you, I realized something. The most important things can't be bought. They're given freely, like you gave Margaret that bracelet." Edward looked down at his shoes, shy but proud. "I just wanted her to know I'm grateful." William put an arm around him. "And you showed me what matters most. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten." He paused, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Love isn't measured in money. It's measured in the courage to give, even when it seems small." Edward leaned against his father's side. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was warm, like the stillness after rain. Days turned into weeks. Without Charlotte's presence, the house slowly reshaped itself. Margaret's laughter filled the kitchen again. Edward's footsteps raced through the hallways, and William found himself at home more often, trading late-night boardroom calls for evenings, helping his son with homework or reading by the fire. One evening, Edward brought a short story from school to read aloud. His voice stumbled at first, but William and Margaret listened intently, smiling at each pause, encouraging him to continue. By the time he finished, the boy's cheeks glowed with pride. "That," William said softly, "was worth more than any deal I've ever signed." Margaret, eyes glistening, touched the bracelet on her wrist. "He's becoming a fine young man." Edward blushed, ducking his head, but his smile gave him away. Life in the Carter mansion didn't become perfect. Grief still visited sometimes, and William still carried the loneliness of a widower. But it became honest. And in that honesty, they found peace. One Saturday afternoon, Edward wandered into the study while William sorted through old files. "Dad," he asked, holding the bracelet box in his small hands, "do you think Mom would have liked Margaret?" William froze. Slowly, he closed the folder and looked at his son. "I think," he said carefully, "your mother would be grateful that someone kind stayed by your side when she couldn't. That's all any parent wants, for their child to be loved." Edward nodded, hugging the box to his chest. "Then I'm glad I gave it to her." William's throat tightened. He pulled his son close, pressing a kiss to his temple. "So am I, son. So am I." That night, as the house settled into quiet, William lingered by Edward's door. He watched his boy sleeping peacefully, the bracelet box resting on the nightstand, and felt a swell of gratitude. He had lost a fiance, yes, but he had gained something far more precious: clarity. The kind of clarity that only a child's pure gesture could bring. And Margaret? She kept the bracelet close, wearing it proudly every day, not because it was silver, but because it was proof that love had roots in the Carter home, roots no one could rip out. For William, the message was indelible. Wealth could vanish, reputations could crumble, but the dignity of his son's heart was non-negotiable. Protecting that was his greatest fortune. The Carter mansion no longer echoed with empty appearances. It rang instead with laughter, gratitude, and truth. And in that truth, father and son rebuilt their lives, not with jewels or contracts, but with something stronger, with love. Which part of this story touched you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to read them. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, so you won't miss any of our next emotional stories.